The morning sun filtered through the glass doors of Miller's diner, casting long shadows across the black and white checkered floor. Sarah Chin adjusted her long sleeves despite the growing warmth of the day, a habit that had become as natural as breathing. At 28, she had perfected the art of blending into crowds, of making herself small and unremarkable. Today, like every other day for the past 3 months, she would serve coffee and eggs to the regulars who barely looked up from their newspapers long enough to acknowledge her existence. The diner sat on the edge of Riverside, a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, except when it came to Sarah. She had arrived in winter, answering a simple help wanted sign in the window, and had been quietly working ever since. The owner, Frank Miller, was a gruff man in his 60s who asked few questions and expected hard work. Sarah provided both silence and diligence, making her the perfect employee for a man who valued efficiency over conversation. "Table 6 needs a refill," called Maria, the other waitress, as she bustled past with plates balanced expertly along her arm. Maria had been working at the diner for 15 years and knew the coffee preferences of half the town. She was kind enough to Sarah, but there was an invisible wall between them that neither had attempted to scale. Sarah preferred it that way. Sarah picked up the coffee pot and made her way to table 6, where Harold Peterson sat with his usual Tuesday morning companion, Bill Jackson. Both men were in their 70s, retired factory workers who had claimed the corner booth as their own personal headquarters for discussing everything from local politics to the weather. They barely glanced up as Sarah refilled their cups, their conversation continuing as if she were invisible. "Heard the Henderson's boy is shipping out next month," Harold was saying, stirring sugar into his coffee with slow, deliberate movements. "Army. Third generation to serve. Good family," Bill nodded approvingly. "Not like these kids today who think service is beneath them. No respect for what others sacrificed." Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she set the coffee pot down, but neither man noticed. She had learned to control these moments, these unexpected triggers that could transport her back to places she fought every day to forget. She focused on breathing steadily, on the familiar weight of her shoes against the diner's worn linoleum, on anything that kept her anchored to the present. "More coffee, miss?" Harold looked up at her for the first time, his weathered face creased with the kind of smile that spoke of a lifetime of small kindnesses. "You're all set," Sarah managed, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. She had become expert at projecting calm when everything inside her was chaos. As she turned to leave, Bill's voice stopped her. "You know, you remind me of my daughter. She's got that same quiet way about her. Lives out in California now, married to a software engineer. Hardly ever calls." There was a wistfulness in his tone that made Sarah pause despite herself. "She sounds nice," Sarah replied, because some response seemed required. "She is. Was always too serious, though. Carried the weight of the world on her shoulders from the time she could walk. Sometimes I wonder if we put too much pressure on her to be perfect." Bill's eyes studied Sarah with a grandfather's intuition. "You remind me of her in that way too." Sarah felt the familiar urge to flee, to disappear into the kitchen where she could lose herself in the mechanical tasks of washing dishes and wiping down counters. Instead, she found herself asking, does she visit often? Holidays, mostly. She's busy with her own life now. As it should be, I suppose. Bill's smile was tinged with the particular sadness of a parent watching their child grow away from them. "But sometimes I think she's running from something. Can't quite put my finger on what." The words hit closer to home than Sarah cared to admit. She nodded politely and retreated to the safety of the counter, where she began the familiar ritual of cleaning coffee pots and organizing sugar packets. These small, repetitive tasks had become her meditation, her way of quieting the voices in her head that never seemed to rest. The diner filled with the usual lunch crowd around noon. Construction workers from the road project outside town, office workers from the small businesses along Main Street, and the occasional traveler passing through on their way to somewhere more important. Sarah moved among them like a ghost, refilling drinks and taking orders with efficient invisibility. It was during the afternoon lull that everything changed. The door chimed as it opened, and Sarah looked up from the register to see a group of 5 men entering. They moved with a particular bearing that she recognized immediately: the straight backs, the alert eyes, the way they naturally fell into formation without conscious thought. Veterans. Her throat tightened as memories threatened to surface, but she forced herself to focus on the immediate task of seating them. They chose a large table near the window, and Sarah approached with menus and water glasses, her movements carefully controlled. The men were clearly comfortable with each other, their conversation easy and punctuated with the kind of good-natured ribbing that spoke of shared experiences and mutual respect. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Sarah said, setting down the glasses with steady hands. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" The man closest to her looked up with a smile that seemed genuine. He appeared to be in his 40s, with graying hair at his temples and laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he still found joy in life despite whatever he might have seen. "Coffee all around, if you don't mind. And maybe some of those pie options we saw advertised in the window." "Of course," Sarah replied, grateful for the straightforward order. "I'll be right back with the coffee." As she turned to leave, she heard one of the men younger than the others, probably in his early 30s, make a comment that stopped her in her tracks. "Did you see all those tattoos?" His voice was pitched low, but not low enough. "Must be quite a story there." Sarah's blood turned to ice. In her haste to serve the table, she had reached across them to set down the water glasses, and her sleeves had ridden up just enough to reveal the edge of what lay beneath. She had thought no one had noticed, had hoped that her careful wardrobe and strategic positioning would keep her secrets safe. The diner seemed to tilt around her as every instinct screamed at her to run. She could feel the familiar panic rising in her chest, the shortness of breath that always preceded the memories she fought so hard to suppress. Her hand gripped the edge of the serving tray until her knuckles turned white. "Everything all right, miss?" The question came from the older veteran, the one who had ordered the coffee. His voice was gentle, concerned, as if he had noticed her sudden pallor. Sarah realized she had been standing frozen beside their table for several long seconds. The other diners were beginning to stare, and she could see Frank looking over from behind the grill with the expression of a man who valued his establishment's reputation above all else. "Fine," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Coffee." "I'll get your coffee." She retreated to the coffee station on unsteady legs, her hands shaking as she tried to fill 5 cups without spilling. The familiar sounds of the diner, clinking silverware, quiet conversations, the sizzle of food on the grill, seemed to fade into background noise as her mind began the unwelcome journey backward through time. Afghanistan. The word echoed in her head like a gunshot, bringing with it the smell of dust and smoke, the weight of gear that never felt quite right, the faces of people she had tried so hard to forget. She had thought she was safe here, in this small town where no one asked questions and everyone minded their own business. She had thought she could simply disappear into the routine of serving coffee and cleaning tables, leaving the past buried where it belonged. But the past, she was learning, had a way of finding you no matter how far you ran. Sarah took a deep breath and picked up the tray of coffee cups. She had survived worse than curious comments from strangers. She had survived things that would break most people, and she would survive this too. All she had to do was serve the coffee, take their order, and get through the rest of her shift. Tomorrow she could decide whether it was time to move on again, to find another small town and another anonymous job where she could try once more to outrun the ghosts that followed her. As she approached the table, she noticed that the conversation among the men had died down. They looked up at her with expressions she couldn't quite read, not judgment or curiosity, but something else. Something that made her feel more exposed than any rolled-up sleeve ever could. "Here's your coffee," she said, setting down the cups with hands that had steadied through sheer force of will. "Have you decided on food?" The older veteran, she noticed now that he wore a baseball cap with an Army Ranger insignia, cleared his throat softly. "Actually, before we order, I was wondering if I could ask you something." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The question she had been dreading, the moment when her carefully constructed anonymity would crumble. She had always known it would come eventually, had prepared herself for the day when someone would see through her defenses and demand answers she wasn't ready to give. "What's that?" she asked, proud of how normal her voice sounded despite the storm raging inside her. The man's eyes were kind but serious, and, when he spoke, his words carried the weight of someone who had seen enough of life to recognize pain in others. "I was wondering if you might be willing to tell us about your service." The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah felt the last of her carefully constructed walls begin to crack. She had spent 3 years trying to leave that part of her life behind, trying to become someone new and unmarked by what she had seen and done. But, standing here in this small-town diner, surrounded by men who wore their own invisible wounds with dignity and pride, she realized that perhaps running wasn't the answer she had thought it was. Perhaps it was time to stop running and start remembering who she used to be before the world taught her to hide. The silence stretched between Sarah and the 5 veterans like a bridge she wasn't sure she had the courage to cross. She could feel the eyes of the other diners upon her, could sense Frank's growing impatience from behind the grill, but all of that faded into insignificance compared to the weight of the question that hung in the air. "My service?" Sarah repeated, her voice barely audible. The words felt foreign on her tongue, as if she were speaking a language she had once known fluently but had forgotten through years of disuse. The older veteran nodded slowly, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "The ink on your arm. Those aren't just any tattoos, are they? They tell a story. And, judging by the way you carry yourself, the way you move, I'm guessing it's a story that deserves to be heard." Sarah felt her throat close. She had spent so long hiding, so long pretending to be someone else, that the thought of revealing her truth felt like stepping naked into a snowstorm. But something in the man's eyes, a recognition, a shared understanding of what it meant to carry invisible wounds, made her hesitate instead of fleeing. "I don't talk about it," she said finally, her hand unconsciously moving to tug her sleeve down further. "That's all right," said another of the veterans, a man with kind eyes and graying hair. "Sometimes the stories choose their own time to be told." But the youngest of the group, the one who had made the original comment about her tattoos, leaned forward slightly. There was something different about him, something harder than the others. "Look, no offense, but a lot of people get military tattoos these days. Doesn't necessarily mean anything. My cousin's got an eagle and flag on his shoulder, and the closest he's been to combat is Call of Duty." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, not because of their harshness, but because of their familiarity. She had heard variations of this doubt before, had seen the skepticism in people's eyes when they learned about women in combat roles. The assumption that her service couldn't have been real, couldn't have been as meaningful or as costly as that of her male counterparts. Something shifted inside her chest, a spark of the person she used to be before the world taught her to hide. Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen had never backed down from a challenge, had never let anyone question her right to wear the uniform or carry the flag. That woman had been buried deep, but apparently not as deep as Sarah had thought. "You're right," she said, her voice growing stronger. "A lot of people do get military tattoos without earning them." She looked directly at the young veteran, meeting his skeptical gaze. "But not many of them get the coordinates of Bugram Airfield tattooed on their forearm. Or the date of Operation Enduring Freedom. Or the names of the 6 members of their unit who didn't make it home." The skepticism in the young man's eyes wavered, replaced by something that might have been recognition. The older veteran straightened in his chair, and Sarah noticed that the conversations at nearby tables had grown quieter, as if the entire diner was holding its breath. "Afghanistan?" asked one of the other men, a quiet respect creeping into his voice. Sarah nodded, her heart hammering so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. 3 tours. 2018 to 2021. Combat medic attached to the 75th Ranger Regiment. The effect of her words was immediate and profound. The 5 men straightened as one, their expressions shifting from casual interest to something approaching reverence. The young skeptic's face had gone pale, and Sarah saw his hand move unconsciously to his own arm, where she now noticed the outline of what looked like a military tattoo beneath his shirt. "Ranger?" The older veteran's voice was barely above a whisper. "Ma'am, we had no idea." "That was the point," Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I came here to disappear. To forget. To be just another waitress in just another small town where nobody asks questions and everybody minds their own business." She paused, looking around the diner that had become her refuge, her hiding place. Frank had emerged from behind the grill and was standing frozen with a spatula in his hand. Maria had stopped pretending to wipe down tables and was openly staring. Even Harold and Bill had turned away from their newspapers to listen. "But I'm tired," Sarah continued, the words coming from a place so deep inside her that she hadn't even known it existed. "I'm tired of hiding. Tired of pretending that part of my life never happened. Tired of acting like the people I served with, the people who died, don't deserve to be remembered." The older veteran was on his feet before Sarah finished speaking, his chair scraping against the diner floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the sudden silence. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "would you mind? Would you be willing to show us?" Sarah felt her breath catch. For 3 years, she had kept her sleeves down, had hidden the ink that told her story in permanent detail across her skin. The tattoos weren't just decorations or artistic expressions, they were her history, her grief, her pride, and her pain, all rendered in black and gray and the occasional touch of color that marked the most important moments. Her hands trembled as she reached for her left sleeve, but not with fear this time. This was something else, something she couldn't quite name. Permission, maybe. Or release. The fabric slid up her arm to reveal what she had kept hidden for so long. The tattoos began at her wrist and disappeared beneath the rolled-up sleeve, clearly continuing much further up her arm. They weren't the casual decorative pieces that many people chose, but rather a complex, interwoven narrative rendered in stunning detail by an artist who understood that some stories required permanent telling. At her wrist, in small, precise script, were GPS coordinates that anyone with military experience would recognize as Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan. Above that, wrapped around her forearm like a bracelet made of memory, were 6 names in elegant script: Marcus Rodriguez, Timothy O'Brien, Jessica Walsh, David Kim, Robert Thompson, and Michael Foster. Between each name was a small star, and beneath the entire circle were the dates: March 15, 2019 to May 22, 2021. But it was what lay above the names that made the veterans gasp. Detailed and expertly shaded, a pair of combat medic wings spread across the wider part of her forearm. The wings weren't just any generic military symbol, they were specific, accurate, the exact design worn by certified combat medics in the U.S. Army. Between the wings, in the center, was the rod of Asclepius, the medical symbol that had guided Sarah through her darkest moments, the reminder that her job was to save lives, not take them. "Jesus," whispered one of the veterans. "Combat medic wings. Do you know how rare those are? Do you know what she had to go through to earn those?" Sarah rolled her sleeve up further, revealing more of the intricate work that covered her upper arm. There, in stunning detail, was a scene that made the watching veterans fall completely silent. It showed a dusty forward operating base under a star-filled sky, with mountains rising in the background. Small figures moved between buildings, and, in the foreground, a female medic knelt beside a wounded soldier, her hands working to save his life while explosions lit the horizon. The artistry was breathtaking, but it wasn't the skill of the tattoo artist that brought tears to the eyes of the watching men. It was the recognition of what they were seeing, a window into experiences that most people could never imagine, rendered permanent on the skin of someone who had lived them. "The detail," breathed the older veteran. "This isn't just art. This is documentation." Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "I had it done in Germany, during my medical leave after my second tour." The artist was a veteran himself, specializes in memorial pieces. "He said my skin was like a canvas that needed to tell the truth." She pointed to small details in the scene: a helicopter in the distance, specific mountain formations, even the correct unit patches on the uniforms of the figures. "Everything is accurate. The base, the terrain, even the stars are positioned exactly as they were on March 15, 2019. The night everything changed." The young veteran who had initially been skeptical now had tears running down his cheeks. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. I had no right to question." "You had every right," Sarah interrupted gently. "There are people who claim service they never earned. You were protecting something sacred, and I respect that." She looked around at all 5 men, then, beyond them to the diner full of people who had become an unintended audience. "But this is why I stopped wearing short sleeves. Not because I'm ashamed of what I did, but because I got tired of having to prove it. Tired of the questions, the doubt, the assumption that someone like me couldn't have been where I was, couldn't have done what I did." Frank stepped forward from behind the grill, his gruff exterior cracking to reveal something softer underneath. "Sarah, in 3 months of working here, I never knew. You never said anything about being military." "You never asked," she replied with a small smile. "And I was grateful for that. This job, this place, it gave me permission to be nobody for a while. To just exist without having to carry the weight of my story everywhere I went." The older veteran, still standing, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, would you be willing to tell us about March 15th? About what happened that night?" Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the beginning of the panic that had plagued her for years whenever anyone asked about specific dates, specific incidents. But, looking around at these faces, veterans who understood, civilians who were learning to understand, people who were ready to listen without judgment, she realized that maybe it was time to stop running from the story that had defined her. "It was my second tour," she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to share. "We were at Forward Operating Base Chapman, about 40 kilometers outside of Kabul. I was attached to a ranger unit conducting night patrols, and I was the only medic for a 12-man team. The diner had become completely silent except for the soft hum of the coffee maker and the distant sound of traffic on the highway. Even the kitchen had gone quiet, as if the entire world was holding its breath to listen to a story that had been waiting 3 years to be told. The Taliban had been increasing their attacks on supply convoys in our sector, and intelligence suggested they were planning something bigger. We were tasked with a reconnaissance mission to identify potential staging areas for IED placements along the main supply route." Sarah paused, her fingers unconsciously tracing the tattoos on her exposed arm. The touch of ink seemed to ground her, to remind her that she had survived what she was about to describe, that she was here and safe and surrounded by people who would understand. "We left the FOB at 2100 hours, just as the sun was setting behind the mountains. It was actually beautiful, one of those nights when you could almost forget where you were and why you were there. The stars were incredible, clearer than anything you can see back home. I remember thinking that my little sister would have loved to see a sky like that." She smiled at the memory, and, for a moment, the shadows that had haunted her features for 3 years seemed to lift. But beauty can be deceptive in a war zone. We all knew that. We'd been doing this long enough to know that the most peaceful moments were often the ones right before everything went to hell. The silence in Miller's diner was so complete that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat as she continued her story. The 5 veterans remained completely still, their coffee growing cold as they listened to words that carried the weight of lived experience, of pain and loss and courage that most people could only imagine. We had been moving through the valley for about 2 hours when our point man, Marcus Rodriguez, signaled for us to halt. Sarah's voice was steady now, as if telling the story had given her a strength she hadn't known she still possessed. Marcus was from San Antonio, about my age, and he had this gift for reading terrain that probably saved our lives a dozen times over 3 tours. If Marcus said stop, you stopped. She paused, her fingers still unconsciously tracing the names on her forearm. He'd spotted something ahead, fresh tire tracks crossing our path, the kind that supply trucks don't make. The spacing was wrong, and they were heading toward the main road where our convoys would be running the next morning. The older veteran leaned forward slightly, his expression intense with recognition. "IED placement." Sarah nodded. "That's what we thought. But, when we moved in to investigate, we realized it was bigger than that. Much bigger. They had been moving heavy equipment through the area, probably for days. We found concealed fighting positions, ammunition caches, even what looked like the beginnings of a command post. This wasn't just about planting roadside bombs. They were setting up for something major." She reached for her water glass with a hand that had steadied through the simple act of remembering, of honoring the people whose names she carried on her skin. Marcus radioed back to base while the rest of us set up a perimeter. That's when everything started to go wrong. The young veteran who had initially doubted her story was now hanging on every word, his earlier skepticism replaced by the recognition of someone who had lived through similar moments of terror and heroism. "Ambush?" 3 sides, Sarah confirmed. They had been watching us, waiting for us to find their staging area. We walked right into it. She was quiet for a moment, lost in memories that played behind her eyes like a movie she couldn't turn off.
The first explosion took out our radio operator, Tommy O'Brien. He was standing maybe 10 feet from me when the RPG hit.
1 second he was laughing about something his girlfriend had written in her last letter, and, the next.
She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Everyone in the diner understood what came next.
I ran toward him without thinking. That's what you do when you're a medic, you run toward the injured, not away from the danger. But, when I got to where Tommy had been standing, there wasn't enough left to save. Her voice cracked slightly on the words, the first sign of the emotion she was fighting to control. I had trained for that moment my entire career. I had practiced on mannequins and, in simulations and, during field exercises. But, nothing prepares you for the reality of losing someone you care about in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Frank had quietly moved closer, along with several other customers who had abandoned their meals to listen. Sarah was vaguely aware of their presence, but her focus remained on the 5 veterans who understood the weight of what she was sharing. The firefight lasted for about 40 minutes, she continued. We were pinned down in a drainage ditch that provided some cover, but we had wounded, and our radio was destroyed.
The enemy knew exactly where we were and exactly what they were doing. This wasn't random violence, it was planned, coordinated, and they had home field advantage. She rolled her sleeve up a little higher, revealing another section of tattoos that showed combat medic supplies, 4 bags, bandages, morphine syringes, all rendered in meticulous detail. David Kim caught shrapnel from the second explosion. Jessica Walsh took a round through the shoulder. Robert Thompson was hit in the leg.
And I was the only medic for 12 Rangers who were taking fire from 3 directions. The admiration in the veteran's eyes was palpable now, mixed with something deeper, recognition of a courage that went beyond training or duty, courage that came from the heart and the soul and the unbreakable commitment to never leave a fallen comrade behind. I crawled from position to position, dragging my aid bag and whatever supplies I could carry. The enemy fire was constant, but I had to reach our wounded. Had to keep them stable until we could get out of there. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if remembering her actions that night reminded her of the person she used to be, the person she was trying to find again. David was unconscious and losing blood fast. I got in 4 started and managed to stop the worst of the bleeding, but he needed surgery and he needed it soon. Jessica was alert but in severe pain, and I could tell the shoulder wound had done nerve damage. Thompson was lucky, the leg wound looked worse than it was. The older veteran was shaking his head in amazement. 3 wounded, under fire, no radio contact.
How did you get them out?
Sarah smiled for the first time since beginning her story, and it transformed her face completely. For a moment, the shadows lifted and everyone in the diner could see the strong, confident woman she had been before the weight of her experiences had taught her to hide. Marcus Rodriguez, she said simply. While I was treating the wounded, Marcus and the rest of the team had been working on a way out. He identified a route through the rocks that would give us concealment, and he coordinated with the other team leaders to provide covering fire while we moved. She pointed to another section of her tattoos, where small figures could be seen moving through mountainous terrain under a starry sky.
We moved as a team.
The uninjured Rangers provided security while I helped transport the wounded. It took us 6 hours to reach the extraction point, moving maybe half a mile in total, but we got everyone out alive.
Everyone? Asked one of the veterans. Sarah's expression darkened slightly. That night, yes.
Everyone made it home from that mission. David spent 2 months in Germany getting his internal injuries repaired, but he made a full recovery. Jessica lost some function in her right arm, but she adapted.
Thompson was back on duty within 6 weeks.
She paused, and the veterans could sense that there was more to the story, something darker that was coming. But that was just March 15, 2019, Sarah continued quietly.
The date that's tattooed on my arm.
The night that I learned I could save people under impossible circumstances, that I could do my job even when everything was falling apart around me. Her fingers moved to another name on the list, and her voice grew heavy.
Marcus Rodriguez died 4 months later.
Different mission, different valley, but the same enemy. He stepped on a pressure plate IED while leading his team through what was supposed to be a cleared path. He died instantly, along with Michael Foster, who was walking right behind him. The diner had become a sacred space, filled with the weight of stories that demanded to be witnessed. Several customers were crying openly, and even Frank, who prided himself on being tough and unsentimental, was wiping his eyes with his apron. Jessica Walsh took her own life 6 months after returning home, Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. The nerve damage in her arm ended her career, and she couldn't find a way to live with being a warrior who could no longer fight. She called me the night before she died, but I was working a double shift and couldn't talk. I've listened to that voicemail 1,000 times, wondering if I could have said something, done something different. The young veteran was crying openly now, his own experiences reflected in Sarah's words. You can't blame yourself for that. You can't carry responsibility for choices other people make. I know that, Sarah replied. Intellectually, I know that. But knowing something and feeling it are two different things. Just like I know that Robert Thompson's overdose 8 months later wasn't my fault, and that David Kim's car accident last year was just a tragic coincidence. But when you're a medic, you spend your entire career believing that you can save people. That if you just work hard enough, train hard enough, care deeply enough, you can keep everyone alive. She looked around the diner, at faces that were seeing her truly for the first time. The tattoos aren't just memorial art. They're a promise. A commitment that these people won't be forgotten, that their sacrifice meant something, that their stories will continue to be told even when the world moves on to other wars and other heroes. The older veteran stood again, and this time all 4 of his companions rose with him. They came to attention with the kind of precision that spoke of years of service and deep respect for what they had just heard. Ma'am, the older veteran said, his voice thick with emotion, it has been an honor to hear your story. And, if I may speak for everyone in this room, it's an honor to meet you. Sarah looked around the diner and realized that something had fundamentally changed. These people, Frank and Maria, Harold and Bill, the construction workers and office employees and travelers, they were looking at her differently now. Not with pity or curiosity, but with respect and understanding and something that looked like gratitude. Thank you, she said quietly. For listening. For letting me tell their story. I hadn't realized how much I needed to do that. But, even as she spoke the words, Sarah knew that this was only the beginning. She had spent 3 years running from her past, trying to bury the memories and the pain and the guilt that came with being a survivor. But, standing here in this small-town diner, surrounded by people who were ready to see her for who she really was, she realized that maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to start living again. The 5 veterans returned to their seats, but the atmosphere in the diner had changed completely. Other customers were approaching Sarah, shaking her hand, thanking her for her service, sharing their own stories of family members who had served. The invisible wall that had surrounded her for 3 years was crumbling, and, for the first time since returning home, Sarah felt like she might actually belong somewhere. But she also knew that telling her story was only the first step. The real challenge would be learning how to live with it, how to honor the memory of her fallen friends while building a future that they would be proud of. And, as she looked around at the faces surrounding her, faces filled with respect and understanding and hope, she began to think that maybe, just maybe, she was ready for that challenge. 6 months after that transformative afternoon in Miller's Diner, Sarah Chen stood before a packed auditorium at Riverside Community College, her hands steady as she adjusted the microphone. The small college had invited her to speak as part of their Veterans Day commemoration, and word had spread throughout the community until the event had outgrown its original venue twice. She wore a simple black dress with 3/4 sleeves that allowed glimpses of her tattoos without displaying them outright. The choice was deliberate, she was no longer hiding, but she wasn't seeking attention either. She was simply being authentically herself for the first time in years. Good evening, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. My name is Sarah Chen, and 3 years ago, if someone had told me I'd be standing here tonight talking about my military service, I would have laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I was so deep in hiding that the idea of public speaking would have terrified me. The audience was diverse, veterans from multiple generations, college students fulfilling community service requirements, families who had heard about Sarah's story through word of mouth that had spread like wildfire through the small town. In the front row sat the 5 veterans from the diner, including James Hartwell, the older veteran who had first recognized her tattoos and changed the course of her life with a simple question. "I came to Riverside to disappear," Sarah continued. "I thought that if I could just become invisible enough, anonymous enough, the memories would fade and the pain would go away. I thought that if I could serve enough coffee and wash enough dishes, I could wash away everything that happened in Afghanistan." She paused, looking out at the faces that were watching her with rapt attention. Among them, she spotted familiar faces from the diner: Frank Miller, who had given her paid leave to pursue the speaking opportunities that had begun flooding in after her story went viral. Maria, who had become not just a co-worker but a true friend. Harold and Bill, whose Tuesday morning coffee discussions now often included Sarah when her schedule permitted. "But trauma doesn't work that way," she continued. "You can't outrun your memories. You can't hide from grief. And you certainly can't honor the people you've lost by pretending they never existed." In the months since that day at the diner, Sarah's life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined. A local reporter who had been having lunch at the diner that day had asked if he could write about her story. That article had been picked up by a regional newspaper, then by a military publication, and eventually by national media outlets that recognized the power of her message about invisible wounds and the cost of service. But, more importantly than the media attention, Sarah had begun to heal. She had started therapy with a counselor who specialized in PTSD and survivor's guilt. She had connected with other female veterans who had faced similar challenges in transitioning back to civilian life. And she had begun to understand that her survival wasn't something to feel guilty about, it was something to honor by living fully and purposefully. "I want to tell you about my friends," Sarah said, rolling up her sleeve to reveal the tattoos that had started this entire journey. "Not how they died, but how they lived. Because that's what matters. That's what deserves to be remembered." She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, which showed a photograph of Marcus Rodriguez in full combat gear, grinning at the camera with the kind of joy that was infectious even across time and distance. "This is Marcus. He was from San Antonio, Texas, and he could read terrain like other people read books. He saved our lives more times than I can count, not through dramatic heroics, but through careful observation and intelligent caution." The audience was completely silent as Sarah shared story after story about each of her fallen comrades, not their deaths, but their lives. Jessica Walsh, who had wanted to be a teacher and had coached Little League baseball in her hometown during her leave time. David Kim, who had been studying engineering before he enlisted and who dreamed of building bridges that would connect communities. Michael Foster, who wrote poetry in his spare time and had been working on a collection about the beauty he found in unexpected places. These weren't just statistics, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger with each story. They weren't just names on a wall or numbers in a report. They were whole human beings with dreams and fears and families who loved them. And part of honoring them means refusing to let their stories be reduced to the circumstances of their deaths. She advanced to the next slide, which showed a picture of the memorial tattoo that covered her upper arm, the scene of the forward operating base under the starlit sky. This tattoo tells the story of March 15, 2019, the night when I learned what I was truly capable of as a medic and as a human being. But it's not just about that one mission. It's about every day we served together, every life we touched, every moment we chose to stand together in the face of impossible circumstances. As she spoke, Sarah noticed that many people in the audience were crying. Veterans were nodding with recognition at experiences they shared but rarely discussed. Civilians were beginning to understand the true cost of the freedom they often took for granted. And, in that sharing, in that vulnerability, something powerful was happening. After her formal presentation, Sarah opened the floor to questions. The first came from a young woman in the front row who appeared to be a college student. "Ma'am, how do you deal with people who don't understand what you've been through? How do you handle it when people say things like thank you for your service but don't really want to know what that service actually involved?" Sarah smiled, recognizing her younger self in the question. "That's a great question, and it's one I struggled with for a long time. I used to get angry at what felt like empty platitudes.
But I've learned that most people genuinely want to be respectful, they just don't know how. They can't understand experiences they've never had, and that's okay. What matters is that we create opportunities for real understanding, like what we're doing here tonight. The next question came from an older veteran who had served in Vietnam. How do you deal with survivor's guilt? How do you make peace with coming home when others didn't? This was the question Sarah had been both hoping for and dreading. It was the one that cut closest to the bone, the one that had driven her into hiding for 3 years. I'm still learning, she said honestly. But I've come to understand that dishonoring my survival doesn't honor their sacrifice. My therapist helped me see that the best way to respect the people I lost is to live a life that would make them proud. To use the skills they helped me develop, to share the stories they can't tell themselves, and to continue the work we started together. She paused, looking directly at the veteran who had asked the question. Marcus Rodriguez didn't save my life on multiple occasions so that I could spend the rest of my days hiding in a diner. Jessica Walsh didn't trust me with her medical care so that I could waste the training she helped me perfect. They invested in me, in my survival, in my future. The best way I can honor that investment is by making something meaningful of the life they helped preserve. As the evening continued, Sarah found herself sharing not just her experiences in Afghanistan, but her journey back to herself. She talked about the importance of mental health care for veterans, about the challenges faced by women in combat roles, and about the power of community support in healing invisible wounds. When I first revealed my tattoos in Miller's Diner 6 months ago, I thought I was just answering a question, she said as the evening drew to a close. But what I was really doing was giving myself permission to exist fully again. To stop apologizing for my survival and start celebrating the strength it represents. She looked out at the audience one final time, her gaze stopping on familiar faces, people who had become her community, her support system, her reminder that she belonged somewhere after all. Tonight, I want to challenge all of us, veterans and civilians alike, to create spaces where difficult stories can be told, where invisible wounds can be acknowledged, and where the complexity of service and sacrifice can be honored without being sanitized. Because when we reduce war to heroic narratives or simple patriotic slogans, we do a disservice to everyone who has served and everyone who loves them. The standing ovation that followed lasted for several minutes, but it was what happened afterward that meant the most to Sarah. One by one, people approached her, veterans sharing their own stories, family members of service members seeking understanding, young people inspired to learn more about military service and its costs. Among them was a young woman about Sarah's age who had been sitting in the back row. She approached hesitantly, and, when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I'm a veteran too, she said. Army, served in Iraq. I've been hiding for 4 years, working night shifts at a hospital because I couldn't handle being around people during the day. After hearing you tonight, I think maybe it's time to stop hiding. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes as she pulled the young woman into a hug. What's your name? Amanda Torres. Amanda, would you like to have coffee sometime? I know this great little diner where they're very welcoming to people with complicated stories. As Amanda nodded gratefully, Sarah realized that this was what her survival had been for. Not just to honor the memory of her fallen friends, but to help other survivors find their way back to themselves. To create the kind of community and understanding that she had desperately needed during her own darkest days. Later that evening, Sarah returned to her small apartment above a bookstore on Main Street, no longer hiding in the cheapest place she could find, but choosing a home that felt like a reflection of who she was becoming. The walls were decorated with photographs from her military service alongside pictures from her new life in Riverside. Her tattoos were visible in several of the photos, no longer hidden but integrated into her identity as a whole person. On her kitchen table sat a stack of letters from other veterans who had heard her story and wanted to share their own. There was also an invitation to speak at a military medical conference about her experiences as a female combat medic, and a request from a documentary filmmaker who wanted to include her story in a project about women in combat roles. But, perhaps most importantly, there was a letter from David Kim's parents, thanking her for keeping their son's memory alive and asking if she would be willing to speak at a scholarship fundraiser they were organizing in his honor.
Sarah picked up the letter and read it again, smiling through tears as she thought about David and his dream of building bridges that would connect communities. In a way, that's exactly what she was doing now, building bridges between military and civilian communities, between past and present, between trauma and healing. She looked down at the tattoos on her arms, no longer symbols of pain and loss but reminders of strength and purpose. Tomorrow she would speak to a group of high school students about military service. Next week she would testify before the state legislature about funding for veterans' mental health services. And next month she would finally fulfill a promise she had made to herself. She would visit the families of each of her fallen comrades, to share memories and stories that only she could tell.
Sarah Chen was no longer hiding.
She was living, fully and purposefully, in honor of those who could not. And, in doing so, she had finally found her way home.